Chapter 9 Four Current Explanations for the Deliverance. Frustrated by the avenging angel finale to the story of the deliverance, experts have come up with several theories to explain Sennacherib's exit. Here are four leading ones. Some scholars and popular historians alike focus on the fact that in 2 Kings 19:7, the prophet Isaiah cites Yahweh as declaring that he, Yahweh, will cause King Sennacherib to hear a report and as a result return to his own land. These writers proposed that the report stated that tensions had erupted somewhere in the empire. Because Assyrians and Babylonians were enemies, the common suggestion is that it was the Babylonians who were fomenting the trouble. Records show that conflict broke out between them in 703 BC and again in 700. Although no evidence exists of hostilities in 701, these writers say, usually with no augmentation, that Babylonian disruption that year could have warranted Sennacherib's urgent attention and forced him to leave. These troubles elsewhere theories, however, do not explain why Sennacherib would have left Kor permanently. After 701, he reigned another 2 decades, yet he never came back to Kor to finish what he had started. Despite his boasts in his annal of being Hezekiah's overlord, his hegemony over Judah in the years after 701 is to be questioned. After quelling any problems elsewhere in his empire, then why would he not return to Judah? He did not lack the opportunity. As one of the top experts on the Assyrian Empire, Daniel David Luckenbill observes in his account of Sennacherib's reign in 699, a period of comparative quiet now set in. If his hands were free, why would Sennacherib not have used his hiatus to reaffirm himself in Kor? It was clearly not because he grew weary of war. Later in his reign, Sennacherib fought in many lands with the same gusto as ever. Why, too, would Sennacherib have had to withdraw all his forces from Judah in order to respond to an emergency elsewhere? Indeed, why could he have not left a modest contingent in place at Jerusalem in order to maintain the siege? With an earthwork already in place to thwart Hezekiah's escape and to prevent any open battle, such a contingent would have kept the siege going indefinitely. These troops would hardly have been restrained from supplies. These troops would have hardly have been stranded far from supplies. The Assyrian province of Samaria lay just 10 miles north of Jerusalem. In the event of a future threat to themselves, the city's besiegers could have obtained military reinforcements from the same source. Sennacherib had already subdued almost all of Judah except for the capital. Jerusalem was located far from the center of Judah, and it was not itself of primary strategic importance. Why did Sennacherib make no effort to turn the rest of the country into an integral part of the Assyrian Empire, similar to Samarina, while Jerusalem was holding out? Most of Judah was in ruins and incapable of further resistance, so such a step would have required few, if any, of his first-string combat soldiers. Garrison troops and imperial administrators could have done the job. The accounts of Herodotus and the Bible on Sennacherib's withdrawal are, of course, very different. The one crediting mice with forcing the one crediting mice with forcing the withdrawal, and the other an angel. But they do have at least two things in common. Given the huge disparity between the versions, recognition of a common denominators is important in trying to discover what might really have happened. In both accounts, the Assyrian retreat because of adverse conditions is the immediate vicinity, that is, the mice and the angel both descending on the Assyrian camp. In other words, in both ancient texts, the Assyrians' problem is close by and occurs inside the theater of war. That differs fundamentally from the troublesome elsewhere theory, which posits that the cause of Sennacherib's departure was distant and external in the campaign in Kor. One question then is this: if this theory is true, why did the lower Egyptian folk memory, the basis of Herodotus' account, and the biblical writers not reflect this matter of distance? Both these sources could have attributed Sennacherib's departure to some event, supernatural or not, that took place outside of Judah and did not require the Assyrians to retreat for their own safety. The second common denominator is that both Herodotus and the biblical narrative depicts Sennacherib's withdrawal as involving duress and compulsion. In Herodotus' account, once the Assyrians discover that the mice have nibbled through their leather equipment and their bowstrings, they flee. Pursued by Egyptian forces, the Assyrians suffered severe losses during their retreat. In the biblical story, after thousands of Assyrians were killed during the night, the survivors abruptly withdraw. In both versions, the Assyrians depart in the conditions of fear and suffering. Those conditions are inconsistent with those of the troublesome elsewhere theory. The theory would lead one to suppose that the Assyrians felt something quite different, frustration for having to quit a campaign before it was over. All three biblical narratives on the invasion state that the angel of Yahweh annihilated many of the Assyrians in their camp outside of Jerusalem, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw. The two earliest accounts in 2 Kings and the book of Isaiah go so far as to say that the angel slew exactly 185,000 men. Obvious hyperbole. One writer suggests that an ambiguity in the original text may have created the high number, and the real meaning may be 185 picked men. That is to say, senior officers. Other biblical experts have likewise labored to make the number of dead seem more plausible. The epidemic theory enjoys a following that is larger than that of the other theories combined. These proponents include some of the most distinguished scholars of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Africa, as well as popular writers and standard reference works. Many of these give at least some weight to the idea that the angel is a metaphor for a disease that suddenly swept through the Assyrian camp. Some adherents also find support in the aforementioned passage in Herodotus, which blames field mice. True enough, ancient literature does offer examples, the Iliad and 1 Samuel 6 through 4-5, of the mouse or rat as a symbol of the plague. And it is, of course, a scientific fact that rodents can be carriers of plague. Although the epidemic theory is dominant in terms of numbers of supporters, it would be inaccurate to say that a scholarly consensus exists in favor of it. From my sampling of more than 100 scholars who deal with the events of 701, perhaps as many as 40% abstain from subscribing to any theory at all. A consensus requires a decisive majority, and the epidemic theory falls short of obtaining that from the overall scholarly ranks. Despite the theory's popularity, no one has dealt with its many problems. For one thing, why wouldn't the biblical storytellers have spelled out that an epidemic was the angel's instrument? The violently sent epidemics enjoy a perfectly honorable place in biblical tradition. Thus, Moses' campaign to pursue the Pharaoh into releasing the children of Israel explicitly included, among other divinely sent calamities, both the disease that felled the Egyptians' livestock and later on the overnight affliction that killed every Egyptian firstborn son. It is inexplicable why the biblical writers should be reluctant to be similarly explicit about the role of disease played in 701, if that indeed was the angel's weapon. Also, at the stage of the campaign in which a disease would have struck, the Assyrians had little soldiering left to do. They had all but won the core campaign. Jerusalem was the only city of consequence that remained to be taken, and they would not have needed their full army to maintain a siege. To be forced to abandon at this very late stage, then, the Assyrians would have had to suffer a truly large-scale epidemical calamities, something that the 2 Kings account with its massive death toll supports. Yet the positioning of the Assyrians would have made that difficult. 2 Kings makes it plain that the Assyrian forces were not all clustered together at the time they suffered distress. The text states that a large army was at Jerusalem and another important force was with Sennacherib at Libnah, at least a day's journey west of the capital. If, as Sennacherib says, the Assyrians attacked a total of 46 Judite cities, it is likely that other military units were assigned elsewhere. Assyria's multi-pronged offensive would have made it hard for disease to strike a crippling blow to the army as a whole. Here's another problem. For Herodotus' account to imply sickness, his mice would have to symbolize disease in the thinking of the Egyptians who told him the story. In some neighboring cultures, some symbolism might hold, but at least two respected Egyptologists, Frank Yurko and Alan Lloyd, have separately concluded that there is no evidence for this in Egypt. Yurko, affiliated with Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History and the University of Chicago, finds significance in Herodotus' allusion to a sculpture that shows Sethos/Shebitku holding a mouse. Yurko says the mice probably entered the story because of the statue that Herodotus saw, which may have represented the cult of Horus of Letopolis, to whom mice were sacred. Horus was the divine warrior defender of Egypt, and Letopolis was a city in the southern delta just north of Memphis. Lloyd, who is at the University of Swansea in Wales, also notes that the mouse would have scared animal was the sacred animal of Horus of Letopolis. In the folk story, if the folk story had intended to depict the Assyrian army as having been devastated by disease, he argues it would have surely have symbolized the disease as an attack by the Memphite Ptah's consort, Sekhmet, a goddess particularly associated with pestilence. He concludes Herodotus' Egyptian sources either did not know or ignored the fact that Sennacherib's army had been ravaged by disease. The mouse's Horus-related symbolism does not in itself invalidate the idea of disease-ravaged Sennacherib forces. That disease ravaged Sennacherib forces. Thus, Lloyd, despite everything, still says that some such disease as typhoid or cholera would be the most probable explanation for the Assyrians' departure. Yurko too says that the probable outbreak of pestilence was at least partly responsible for the withdrawal. Nonetheless, the respective analysis of the mouse disease symbolism weaken the case for this theory. Lloyd and Yurko's reason for clinging to the epidemic theory deserves airing. Lloyd points out that 2 Kings Chronicles 32 verses 3 to 4 describes the Hebrew as tampering. Describes the Hebrews as tampering, Lloyd's words, with the water supplies. To him, this means contamination. Yurko also suggests that denied access to fresh water, the Assyrians resorted to using the disease-causing water. Yet the biblical passage in question gives no reason to suppose this. It says simply that the people blocked up all the springs and the streams that flowed through the land. Why the people said should Assyrian kings come here and find plenty of water? Emphasis added. That indicates the strategy rested on the deprivation, not the contamination of water. This does not preclude the possibility that Judah fouled the water supply, but where the Bible had a perfect opportunity to mention that, it does not. Finally, once the health of his army was returned, what would have kept Sennacherib out of Judah and southern Philistia for the rest of his career? The simplest idea of all draws its inspiration from the opening of the Second King's account. When Hezekiah tells the invading Sennacherib, "I admit my guilt, withdraw from me, and whatever you impose upon me I shall bear." The idea, Jerusalem surrendered. While this camp has far fewer backers than the disease theory, in recent years it has been gaining support rapidly. Adherents include biblical scholars of the highest quality, among them Ronald Clements of King's College at the University of London and Francolino Goncalves of l'École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem, both of whom have written books on Sennacherib's invasion that command admiration. Clements for its nuanced insight into the book of Isaiah's theology, Goncalves for the thoroughness and fairness with which it evaluates the vast body of scholarly opinion on Sennacherib's campaign. Problems, however, abound. For example, the Rab Shekav, voicing Sennacherib's instructions, presented Jerusalem with terms of surrender that centered on mass deportation. Why would Assyria change? Also, Hezekiah's declaration, "I admit my guilt," is not a surrender statement. Such an avowal avowal of fault and willingness to make a generous payment could be a necessary condition for reaching an agreement with Sennacherib on an Assyrian withdrawal after he, Sennacherib, suddenly no longer held a clear military advantage. Abundant tribute would in effect be a payment to ensure that he did not return. The theory's premise is that Sennacherib, enjoying military supremacy as much as ever, would show mercy to Jerusalem. Proponents would strengthen their case if they could point to several cases, or even one case of an Assyrian emperor of this general period showing similar leniency. In Sennacherib's annals of his lengthy reign, certainly no such aptitude for mercy is to be found. Any pardon by Sennacherib of a late surrendering Hezekiah would then have represented a stunning aberration from normal Assyrian imperial policy. No supporter of this theory musters strong arguments to show why such mercy would have been in Sennacherib's self-interest. The empire could not have permitted such leniency. It would have sent the wrong message to other restive vassals. If Sennacherib did not accept Hezekiah's submission, why would he have said so in his annals? Why would he not have said so in his annals? There would have been no shame in it. Hezekiah's capitulation would have flatly contradicted an assessment of that king by biblical writers. 2 Kings says of Hezekiah, in all that he undertook, he was successful. It is hard to imagine that even the most fawning of biographers might describe a leader who surrenders his country as having enjoyed an unqualified successful career. My biggest problem with the surrender theory is that followed to its inadvertent but logical conclusion, it necessarily implies that the Bible was breathtakingly deceitful. The theory would mean that the biblical writers would have cynically turned an abject submission to Assyria into a miraculous intervention in which Yahweh demonstrates his love for his people. Proponents give no indication that they have considered this problem. The theory also implies that Yahweh had an extremely questionable sense of justice. The Assyrians show extraordinary mercy to Jerusalemites, and Yahweh rewards them with mass death and defeat. To top this off, these early writers of the Bible would have described Hezekiah as a hero who had faith in Yahweh to end in Yahweh, God of Israel. He puts his trust. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah following him, or among those before him. The Hebrew surrender theory would seem to imply that Hezekiah, by rejecting Isaiah's advice in the story to hold fast and to trust in the Lord, utterly lacked such faith. His elevated reputation, therefore, would rest on the foundation of fraud. So too would Jerusalem's eventual extraordinary sacred status, as the belief spread among subsequent generations that Yahweh so loved Zion that he would always defend it. The final theory involves the Cushites. Years ago, I attended an investigative reporter's seminar at which a well-known journalist, Seymour Haresh, was a speaker. Haresh talked about the laborious research that had gone into the chilling expose of how U.S. soldiers had massacred defenseless civilians in the Vietnamese village of My La, a revelation that helped undermine American public opinion support for the Vietnam War, and that won for the journalist the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. The Haresh told us how, as a then obscure freelancer, he had gotten wind of the tragedy. Subsequently, he looked up My La in a newspaper's library. Not expecting to find anything, to his amazement, he discovered a clipping of an alleged mass killing in that village. This article was, if I remember correctly, a wire service account, just 1 or 2 paragraphs long. It understated the scale of the slaughter and was too incomplete to have attracted public attention. But the gist of Haresh's eventual story was there. Somehow Haresh told us the major media's correspondents had simply let the original story slide by, never following it up. It was left to him, a newcomer outside of the journalistic establishment, to recognize the event's significance, to explore in detail how it occurred, and then to ensure that the story got out to the public. During my research, that anecdote kept coming to my mind. Long after I thought I was the lone originator of the Cushite rescue theory, I kept stumbling across flips of it elsewhere, the equivalent of that wire service clipping. Modern scholars have now and again suggested that the Battle of El Teka did not knock Cushite Egyptian forces out of the conflict. Observing that 2 Kings 19:9 says that a Tirhaka-led force was advancing towards Syria, a handful of these scholars arrive at 4 different views of what might have happened afterwards. The British Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen suggests that when the Cushite Egyptian forces surged back a second time, Sennacherib's forces were scattered at Jerusalem and other locations. To confront the new Cushite Egyptian threat, the Sennacherib had hastened to regroup his own dispersed troops. When the Cushite commander realized he would have to do battle with all the Assyrians at once instead of piecemeal, he discreetly retreated to Egypt. The true reason for the Assyrian withdrawal, Kitchen concludes, was sudden disease. In short, Kitchen adheres to the epidemic theory with a sidebar of Cushite Egyptian resilience. This comeback, however, is meek and short-lived. Kitchen insists that it had little bearing on Sennacherib's decision to withdraw. Indeed, Kitchen goes as far as to say that Pharaoh Shibitku's foreign policy lacked real achievement. Still, Kitchen's discussion of post-El Teka events in the most detailed treatment of the events that I've seen. In it, he makes 2 valuable points. He supports the view that 2 separate Cushite Egyptian armies existed. Though Sennacherib's annals in the Bible each speak of only one army, these sources, he says, are referring to different armies. After Sennacherib's defeat, the first army at El Teka, its survivors might have joined the army that later appeared in Kor. As well, Kitchen shows that the dispersal of Sennacherib's forces provided the second army, Taharkas, with a sudden golden opportunity to strike. Where Kitchen errs, I believe, is in his negative assessment of Taharka's army turning tail when the Assyrians regrouped. A second view proposes a dual explanation for Sennacherib's departure, that is, Taharka's approach combined with one or more of the other's theories. Thus, Yurko suggested in 1980 that disease probably played a key role in the Assyrians' withdrawal, but the report of Taharka's advance may have also had something to do with it. It was after the receipt of this rumor that perhaps, at least in part because of it, that Sennacherib suspended operations in Judah and returned ultimately to Assyria. To back his claim, Yurko provides fresh and valuable insights into the logistics of how the young prince might have brought his force from Cush to Judah. Yet Yurko's article gives only muted, half-hearted credit to the role of the 25th dynasty military forces in ending the conflict. The article leaves one with the impression that the outbreak of disease was critical. Hezekiah's blockage of water sources, it says, might well have induced an outbreak of pestilence. Indeed, touching another base, the article even suggests the Babylonian restiveness as an added factor. In his 1988 book, Lloyd says that while the main cause of the withdrawal was an epidemic, an incipient Babylonian rebellion and possibly a Cushite advance may have contributed it. In this context, he writes but one sentence of the possibility of Taharka's involvement. Writing in 1989, D.J. Wiseman, professor of Assyriology at the University of London, also finds traces of Cushite participation. He suggests that Taharka's intervention in combination with the outbreak of disease, perhaps bacillary dysentery, turned Assyria back. He gives 2 sentences to this. In a 1991 book, William Hamilton Barnes gives the same dual credit. I suspect that some sort of renewed Egyptian activity may well have something to do with this remarkable deliverance. Indeed, a sudden outbreak of the plague, perhaps, coupled with the threat of renewed Egyptian pressure, may well have forced Sennacherib to break off the siege. Barnes of Southeastern College in Florida does not expand beyond these two sentences. I think all four of these scholars are right in giving some credit to the Kushites in the post-Eltekid stage of the conflict. They do not, however, give credit enough. None of these present a solid argument for why disease would have been so instrumental. Their views tend to be buried in obscure academic writings that general readers do not normally see. These scholars' treatment is fleeting, a sentence or two here or there. Yurko is the most expansive, devoting several paragraphs to Egypt's military revitalization under the 25th dynasty, but disease still overshadows Kush's possible role in Sennacherib's withdrawal. These scholars' treatment of the Kushite role is so weakly presented that their argumentation, if one can call it that, will persuade few people. At third view, which Luckenbill and Donald Redford espouse, is closer to what I feel is the truth. In a 1924 book on Assyria, Luckenbill suggests that the Kushite Egyptian forces could be solely responsible for an ousting of Sennacherib. In a four-sentence passage, the longest sustained discussion that I have encountered on actual Kushite success against Sennacherib, Luckenbill says that the Battle of El-Teka conceivably could have occurred not before the siege of Jerusalem, as Sennacherib's account appears to place it, but during the siege. The professor of Semitic languages at the University of Chicago says it is altogether possible that Sennacherib may have been fought to a standstill, and he had abandoned the siege. The cautious suggestion has received scant attention, and I'm unaware of a single citation by other writers in the ensuing 70-odd years. In a 1992 book, Redford goes even further than Luckenbill. The Egyptologist from the University of Toronto says that the Battle of El-Teka itself was an outright victory for the Kushite Egyptian army. Of El-Teka, he declares flatly, there can be no doubt that it was an unexpected and serious reverse of Assyrian arms, and contributed significantly to Sennacherib's permanent withdrawal from the Levant. He presents this startling, unequivocal hypothesis in just two sentences, however, with little argumentation to back it up. While many other scholars say Sennacherib exaggerates the extent of any victory in El-Teka, Luckenbill suggests that the battle was a possible draw, and I'm aware of no one besides of Redford who asserts that it was a flat-out defeat for Assyria. Indeed, 3 pages later, in his next allusion to the crisis of 701, Redford's tone seems slightly less emphatic. Whereas before he had said that the 25th dynasty had contributed to Sennacherib's withdrawal significantly, now it is only partly responsible for it. I accept Luckenbill and Redford's hypothesis that the Kushite Egyptian force played a major role in turning back the Assyrians, yet even though I think they are right, they are unconvincing. These scholars simply declare their view, offering little supporting evidence. As with the other writers who give partial credit to the Kushites, this means their hypothesis languishes from inattention. Indeed, the passing treatment all these writers give to the denouement of the invasion conveys little appreciation of the event's historical significance. Most readers of their books and articles might assume that the event was of negligible consequence. The larger problem with Luckenbill and Redford's hypothesis is the reasoning behind it. They say that the decisive event in the entire conflict was the Battle of El-Teka. If that clash was what truly forced Sennacherib to lift the siege at Jerusalem, it would, as Luckenbill says, have had to take place after the siege was underway. 2 Kings says that Sennacherib was at Lachish during the siege. Sennacherib's invasion took him from Sidon south down Kor's coastal plain, and El-Teka is located well after Lachish. After capturing Lachish, Sennacherib's army would have had to travel about 20 miles north as the crow flies to an area through which it already passed. Why? What possible strategic objective could Sennacherib have attained by backtracking to this pacified area? it would take the king farther away from the besieged Jerusalem, his main remaining challenge. Redford's assertion that there can be no doubt that El Teque was a serious reverse for Sennacherib requires an explanation of why the Assyrian king would lie so egregiously about the battle's outcome. That Sennacherib's annals are self-serving is plain. He inflated his victories and minimized, or in the case of the core campaign, omitted his setbacks. But it would be quite another level of deceit for the king to claim victory if, in fact, he suffered a crashing campaign and in defeat. Propaganda though they are, Sennacherib's annals are the record, and it is hard to dismiss the record outright, especially without supporting argument. Still, although their reasoning is untenable, I believe Luckenbill and Redford are headed in the right direction when they suggest that Cushite Egypt's forces made a strong showing in the end. I see no reason to dispute the widespread view that the Cushite-led force at El Teque suffered either a modest setback or at best achieved a draw. Whatever the outcome, the Battle of El Teque did not have a decisive impact on the larger conflict. The pivotal event would have taken place well after El Teque. In my opinion, the best account of the failure of Sennacherib's campaign is in the book published in 1978, reissued in 1997, Battles of the Bible. The author of this in-depth description of ancient conflicts are Chaim Herzog and Mordecai Gishon. Several years after the book's publication, Herzog became president of Israel, 1983 to 1993. Prior to that, he had been ambassador to the United Nations, governor of the West Bank, and chief of the military intelligence in the Israeli Defense Force. He has published several books on Israel's history. Herzog's co-author, Gishon, is a senior lecturer in military history and classical archaeology at Tel Aviv University. Like Herzog, he came to the study of history via a successful career in intelligence work. After the Assyrians won at El Teque, say Herzog and Gishon, Sennacherib's rampage over the countryside, at that moment, the Egyptian pharaoh Tirhaka culled fresh hope from the intelligence that Sennacherib was wasting his forces in Judah and decided that no better opportunity would be found to fall upon the weakened Assyrian rear and bring about Sennacherib's complete defeat. When Sennacherib became aware of this imminent danger, he had no choice but to break off contact everywhere and to beat a hasty and an ignominious retreat under cover of night. Of all the books and articles I have seen, this comes closest to what I feel really happened. In the past 2 decades that have passed since the book's publication, I am not aware of any citations of these authors in this context. It is hard not to see why Battles of the Bible devotes only those 2 sentences quoted above to the role of Taharka's army. The book gives no argumentation for how Taharka was able to achieve this. It gives no sources, and it casts Taharka's role within a rather questionable war scenario. Interestingly, the 2 former military intelligence officers also failed to identify Taharka himself as a Cushite, despite the fact that 2 Kings 19:9 plainly describes him as such. They only call him Egyptian. Nor do they say that the army that had fought at El Teque contained any Cushite elements. Of all the scholarly treatments of the 701 conflict, this is the only one that I know of that completely skips over the advancing army's Cushite content. But there is something still more peculiar about Herzog and Gishon's treatment. In the 9 pages that the book spends on Hezekiah's conflict with Sennacherib, Taharka's army with its 2 sentences gets far less attention than of all people, Hezekiah's ancestor, King Rehoboam, son of Solomon, using the book of 2 Kings Chronicle as their source. Herzog and Gishon credit Rehoboam with building Lachish and other fortified cities in Judah. Because the Assyrians lost many men while taking these sites, the author suggests that they are leery of confronting Taharka's army. For Battles of the Bible, defensive emplacements 2 centuries old at the time of Hezekiah, thus overshadowed Taharka's own role in the so-called miracle of 701. Displaying a transparent nationalist bias, the authors stress that these aging fortifications, not the foreign army, played a decisive part in Sennacherib's withdrawal. This is a bit like saying that the ultimate credit for London's survival of the Blitz in World War II belongs not to the aviators and other active defenders, but to bygone builders of the underground and various deep basements that were used as public shelters. These occasional scholarly accounts that credit Taharqa's army with varying degrees of success have then several things in common. They tend to be extremely brief. They're unconvincing. They present the Kushite role in forcing Sennacherib's departure not as an upfront, coherent theory, but rather a pseudo-fossé, only a parenthetical aside. Indeed, in a puzzling omission, not one of the accounts that credits the Kushites with some role ever alludes even vaguely to the historical importance of the Assyrian departure. A reader would assume the conflict to have been a trivial anecdote of history. Little wonder that these accounts have no impact whatever on the public understanding of Africa's role in Western history.